Next, we are going to see about certain factors that can affect the activity of respiratory centers. Okay, just now we have discussed the case of 4 respiratory centers in the brain stem, which are the dorsal respiratory group of neurons, ventral respiratory group of neurons, apneustic center and pneumotaxic center. Okay, so which are the factors that can influence these centers? Factors influencing. So first one, higher centers. Okay, we know that the dorsal respiratory center is the principal center which can produce inspiration. Okay, but not only these centers, but also some centers, but also some higher regions in the brain can influence the respiration. Not only the respiratory center, but also some other regions of the brain. Okay, that is cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex is a higher center which can have direct effect on the dorsal respiratory group of neurons. Okay, if there is a need of hyperventilation, what happens? The signals, the stimulatory signals, it comes directly from the cerebral cortical cortex region to the dorsal respiratory group of neurons. It enhances. So what happens? The inspiration will be lengthier. Inspiration will be more powerful. Okay, and also this apneustic center can also be stimulated by means of this higher centers. Okay, so first let me tell you, this higher center is having role in enhancing or decreasing the respiratory activity. Okay, like cerebral cortex. Next one is Herring-Brewer reflex. Okay, Herring-Brewer reflex. Okay, it is a reflex that can happen upon the lungs. Okay, in the lungs, we know that in the lungs there are certain receptors. Okay, we know that the lungs is an elastic organ which can stretch. Okay, but the lungs, at certain point, the stretch of the lungs have to be eliminated. If the lungs is overstretched, the lungs can collapse. Okay, so we know that lungs is an elastic organ. It can stretch and it can constrict, recoil. Okay, stretch and recoil. But there is certain point of at which the stretching of the lungs have to be ceased. Okay, otherwise if the lungs is overstretching, it can damage or collapse the lungs. Okay, so for restricting this stretch at a particular point, there are certain stretch receptors in the lungs. Okay, in the lung tissues there are certain receptors, stretch receptors, which can perceive stretch stimuli. Okay, if the lungs is starting to get stretched, these stretch receptors will be little activated. If it has stretched to a maximum extent, this will be having more active and it will be producing more impulses directly to the dorsal respiratory group of neurons. Okay, so from the lungs, the inspiratory signals, from the stretch receptors of the lungs, the inhibitory signals, okay, the inhibitory signals goes to the dorsal respiratory group of neurons. So what does it do? It inhibits. Since these are inhibitory signals, it inhibits the dorsal respiratory group of neurons. So the inspiration will be ceased. Okay, when the inspiration is ceased, the stretching of lungs is restricted. Only when the air is more and more air is accommodating in the lungs will be overstretched, right? So when this inspiration is ceased at a certain point, what happens? This stretching of the lungs can be ceased at a point. Okay, and this kind of reflex is known as Herring-Brewer reflex. This is purely a reflex because there is one stimuli. What is stimuli? Stimuli is stretch. There is one response. What is response? The inspiration is ceased. Okay, reflex is one sudden response to any stimuli. Okay, so Herring-Brewer reflex, because of the stimuli of certain stretch receptors, the stretch of the overstretching of the lungs can be prevented. Okay, by its firing of inhibitory signals on the dorsal respiratory group of neurons, so it is inhibited, so the inspiration will not occur any further. Okay, so second one is Herring-Brewer reflex. And third one is certain irritant receptors. Not only the stretch receptors, but certain irritant receptors also is produced in the respiratory tract. Okay, not in the lungs, in the respiratory tract, in bronchi and bronchioles. Okay, yes, of course, in the lungs. So, irritant receptors, certain that is, these can be stimulated, but by certain irritant chemical substances. For example, if some chemicals like ammonia or sulfur dioxide is getting trapped into the respiratory tract, okay, these chemical agents can have direct stimulation on the irritant receptors. So the irritant receptors sense that there is something bad in the respiratory tract, it has to be readily wiped out. Okay, so these irritant receptors will produce impulses on the respiratory centers. And what happens? First of all, it produces stimulation on the dorsal respiratory group of neurons. Okay, just observe, when we are inhaling some irritant substances, we'll sneeze. Okay, the most common, most important action for eliminating this irritant chemicals out of the respiratory tract is the action of sneezing. Sneezing, what are the actions that we can see in sneezing? First, we'll take a deep inspiration, like, then we'll just rush this air out. Okay, very suddenly this air will be out. Okay, so it can produce one hyperventilation first, that is one deep inspiration first. Then what happens? This bronchi and bronchioles in the lungs, no, it will be suddenly constricting. Okay, suddenly it will be closing. So what happens? This irritant object that is stuck in the respiratory tract will rush outside. Okay, rush to the outside. So this irritant chemicals can be eliminated from the body. Okay, so the irritant receptors can produce an action known as sneezing. Okay, by producing hyperventilation first, and then bronchospasm. Bronchospasm means sudden constriction of bronchi and bronchioles. Okay, first we'll take a deep breath and we'll rush the air outside by the sudden constriction of this respiratory tract, like bronchi and bronchioles. Okay, so there comes the role of irritant receptors. And there are certain other receptors in the body, like temperature receptors, which can influence respiration. Okay, temperature receptors, there are receptors for cold and receptors for warmth in the body. Okay, when the body is exposed to a cold region, this cold receptors get activates. When the body is exposed to warm region, it is warm receptors. Okay, and during when the person is exposed to cold region, this ventilation will be higher. Okay, it is characterized by hyperventilation. Why? Why? Because during cold region, the aim is that it has to be returned back to its normal temperature, right? During cold, it has to be made warmth. Okay, warmer. Okay, so what is happening? More metabolism. Okay, the metabolism of the cell have to be enhanced. So hyperventilation. Okay, hyperventilation provides more oxygen into the blood, into the cells. So more metabolic reaction. We know that byproduct that is eliminated, that is generated during metabolic reaction is heat. Okay, heat is liberated during the metabolic reactions. So by the hyperventilation, more oxygen is provided into the cell. So more metabolic process is being taking place. So more heat is generated in body. Okay, so we can escape from the cold exposure of the body. And in the warmth also, the ventilation can be decreased. Okay, so like that, there are certain temperature receptors in the body. Okay, cold, if we are exposed to cold, these cold receptors are activating. So these cold receptors stimulates the dorsal respiratory group of neurons, so it can produce hyperventilation. Hyperventilation means increased inspiration and increased expiration. Okay, and there are certain other receptors like proprioceptors, baroreceptors, okay, and certain chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors are receptors which can perceive any change in the chemical constituents of the blood. Okay, not any chemicals, it is the oxygen and carbon dioxide content in blood. Okay, chemoreceptors are, next most important one is chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors are certain receptors, okay, which can sense change in the oxygen and carbon dioxide content in the blood. Okay, so if the chemoreceptor is sensing low oxygen in the blood, what is required? Hyperventilation. Okay, if the blood is having low oxygen level, what has to be enhanced? Inspiration have to be enhanced, right? So which part of the respiratory center have to be enhanced, have to be stimulated? Dorsal respiratory group of neurons. Okay, when there is low oxygen, this chemoreceptors will stimulates the dorsal respiratory group of neurons, so the inspiration is increased. Okay, the hyperventilation, inspiration is increased, so more oxygen comes to the body, and that's the same amount is given outside also, so expiration is also occurring. Okay, and when there is high carbon dioxide accumulation in blood, okay, if the chemoreceptors is sensing more carbon dioxide in blood, what has to be done? Again hyperventilation, more oxygen is taken into the blood and the depth of expiration can also be increased. Okay, in such a case also the chemoreceptors is having direct effect on the respiratory centers, and it can decrease or increase the depth of inspiration and expiration. Okay, so also the thermoreceptors, proprioceptors, baroreceptors. Okay, all these are factors which can influence the dorsal respiratory group of, the respiratory centers. Okay, all of these respiratory centers can be influenced by these factors. Thank you.